Imagine this. In 240 BCE, a man named Eratosthenes used two sticks, the shadow of the sun at noon, and the distance walked by a camel caravan to calculate the circumference of the Earth, and got it almost exactly right. No satellites, no calculus, no advanced instruments. His full proof, his complete methodology, and all the supporting calculations were written down. And we lost them. Not in one dramatic fire, not in a single Hollywood moment. We lost them slowly, scroll by scroll, scholar by scholar, over centuries of neglect, politics, and indifference. Now ask yourself the real question. What if it had never happened? What if the greatest intellectual institution the ancient world ever built had survived? What if every generation after Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, Archimedes, and Herophilus had been able to build directly on their full, undamaged work instead of reconstructing fragments centuries later? How much further ahead would we be today? How many centuries of scientific progress did we actually lose? Most people believe the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in one night by Julius Caesar's fire. That's a powerful story. It's also almost entirely wrong. And the truth is far more disturbing. Because here's the thing. Most people carry around a version of this story that is almost entirely wrong in the specific ways that matter most. They picture a building. They picture Julius Caesar setting fire to ships in the harbor in 48 BCE, the flames jumping to the docks, racing up the waterfront to a great stone library and consuming it in a single catastrophic night. Dramatic, definitive, over. And that version is, let me be very precise about this, almost certainly not what happened. And the actual history is significantly more devastating once you understand what it means for the timeline of human progress. The fire that Caesar's campaign may have caused destroyed books on the docks, possibly a warehouse of texts waiting for export, possibly a subset of the library's holdings. Ancient sources disagree. What the historical record actually shows, pieced together from Strabo's observations during his visit to Alexandria around 20 BCE, from Plutarch, from the Byzantine scholar John Tzetzes, who worked from sources we no longer have, is a library that declined gradually, catastrophically. And for reasons that should make any civilization that considers itself serious about knowledge feel genuinely uncomfortable. The Mouseion, the full institution of which the library was the intellectual core, was founded around 295 BCE by Ptolemy I Soter and his advisor Demetrius of Phalerum, a student of Aristotle's. This matters because the institution was not an archive. It was a research university 7 centuries before the medieval European university tradition existed. It had lecture halls. It had a dining hall where scholars ate together and argued. According to ancient sources compiled by historian Luciano Canfora, it housed somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its peak, a range that historians still debate, but the lower bound of which already represents a scale of accumulated knowledge so staggering that it's worth sitting with for a moment. 400,000 scrolls. And just to be clear about what a scroll represents, this is not a page or a pamphlet. A scroll typically contained a substantial text, a play, a scientific treatise, a mathematical proof with all its supporting work, a medical manual with documented procedures. The Iliad was 24 scrolls. What the library held was the intellectual output of the Greek world, the Egyptian world, the Persian world, the Babylonian world, the Jewish scholarly tradition, assembled through a documented acquisition policy of near piratical ambition. Ships docking at Alexandria were legally required to surrender any books they carried for copying. The originals were sometimes kept and the copies returned. Ptolemy III wrote to every monarch in the known world requesting the loan of their official texts. He borrowed the official Athenian copies of the plays of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, paid the enormous deposit required, had them copied, and sent back the copies. He kept the originals, documented, verified by ancient sources. a civilizational acquisition program that had no modern equivalent until the Internet. And the Internet, notably, is still running. And here's what the historical record actually shows about what happened to it. Not fire, not Caesar, though the harbor fire was real and did damage. What destroyed the Library of Alexandria was money and politics, and the specific way that institutions die when the people in charge stop caring about them. The Roman imperial period brought reduced funding. The intellectual community dispersed. Scholars went to Rome, to Antioch, to Athens, where the patronage was. The Mouseion continued in attenuated form, but Strabo, visiting around 20 BCE, describes it in ways that suggest its golden age was already behind it. Then the political violence of the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. The Emperor Aurelian's reconquest of Alexandria in 270 CE destroyed much of the Bruchaion, the royal quarter where the main library was located. Theophilus, the Christian bishop of Alexandria, oversaw the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE, where a secondary collection, the daughter library, was housed. And then in 415 CE, the last documented head of the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, the mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, was murdered by a Christian mob. Not metaphorically. She was pulled from her chariot, taken to a church, and killed. She represents, in the historical record, something close to the final chapter of the library's living intellectual tradition. This is the part that gets me every single time. The library didn't burn in a night. It died over 600 years, and that slow death meant that the loss wasn't clean. It wasn't a catastrophe that announced itself. It was incremental, scroll by scroll, scholar by scholar, generation by generation, until the knowledge was simply not there anymore. Until people were working from incomplete copies of copies, from references in texts that survived to works that didn't, from the intellectual equivalent of trying to reconstruct a building from photographs of its shadow. And here's what the historical record and scholarly analysis suggests about the scale of the specific traditions that died with it. Because this is where the civilizational implications begin to land with real force. Hipparchus of Nicaea worked in Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE. He is, by consensus among historians of astronomy, the father of the discipline. He compiled the first known star catalog, measuring the positions of over 800 stars. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete one cycle. Think about that. A man in the 2nd century BCE, working with naked eye observations and geometric reasoning, detected a phenomenon operating on a 26,000-year timescale. His complete works are gone. We know about them almost entirely through Ptolemy's Almagest, written 3 centuries later, which uses Hipparchus's data while frequently failing to explain his methods. Historian of science Alexander Jones has spent significant scholarly energy trying to reconstruct what Hipparchus's original proofs and methodologies looked like, working from the fragments that survive. It is, in Jones's own framing, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from someone else's description of how it made them feel. And Hipparchus is not an outlier. He is representative of an entire intellectual tradition whose complete works are simply not available to us. Stay with me because this is where it gets genuinely strange. Heron of Alexandria, 1st century CE, described a device that used steam pressure to produce rotational motion. It is, in essential mechanical principle, a steam engine, not a thought experiment, a documented, designed, described device. Historians debate whether it was ever built at scale or remained a curiosity. But here's the thing. The reason that debate even exists is precisely because the intellectual tradition surrounding it, the engineering knowledge base in which it sat, the broader context of Alexandrian mechanical and pneumatic engineering, documented in works like Hero's own Pneumatica and Mechanica, survived only in fragments through Byzantine transmission. We do not know what other pneumatic and mechanical engineering the library held. We do not know how close the ancient world came to applying the principles it demonstrably understood to practical industrial-scale problems. We know what was not lost. We are largely guessing about what was. If this is already making you rethink what you thought you knew about the history of science and how fragile the transmission of knowledge actually is, subscribe. We go this deep every single week, and the next layer of this is where the civilizational implications become genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. The medical tradition is the place where the loss becomes most viscerally felt, and I want to spend time here because I don't think it's discussed enough outside of specialist circles. Herophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Chios conducted systematic human dissection in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, the first documented program of anatomical research in Western history. Herophilus distinguished between tendons and nerves. He described the structure of the brain, identified the cerebrum as the seat of intelligence, named the duodenum. He measured the pulse using a water clock. Erasistratus came closer to describing the circulation of the blood than any thinker would again until William Harvey in 1628 CE. Almost 2,000 years later, their complete works are gone. What we have of their findings comes through Galen, writing 4 centuries after them, in much the same way we have Hipparchus through Ptolemy. At second hand, filtered through another thinker's framework, with the original reasoning and evidence largely inaccessible to us. And just to be clear about the timeline here, William Harvey's description of blood circulation in 1628 CE is one of the foundational moments of modern medicine. Erasistratus was working in that intellectual direction in 270 BCE. That is a gap of approximately 19 centuries. Not 1,000 years of potential acceleration, 1,900 years. And the reason it is 1,900 years is not that the human mind was incapable of closing it faster. It is that the institutional knowledge base that supported this kind of empirical inquiry was destroyed, and reconstructing it from nothing without the Alexandrian tradition to build on took the European medical tradition until the Renaissance and beyond. Here's the thing that the alternate history requires you to really sit with. The library surviving is not simply about preserving old texts. It is about the continuity of an institutional culture, a way of approaching knowledge that was, in the ancient world, genuinely and documentably different from what replaced it. The Mouseion was a place where scholars from different traditions, Greek mathematics, Egyptian astronomical records, Babylonian numerical methods, Persian natural history, worked in proximity and produced synthesis. The mathematician Euclid worked there in the 3rd century BCE. His Elements, which survived, became the foundational text for geometric reasoning used by every mathematician from the medieval Islamic world through Newton. Now ask yourself, what else was being produced in that same environment by thinkers working in the same intellectual atmosphere as Euclid, whose work did not survive because no Byzantine copyist happened to transcribe their manuscripts before the institutional infrastructure that housed them collapsed? We have Euclid because someone made the specific contingent decision to copy his work. We do not have Hipparchus's complete proofs or Herophilus's anatomical treatises because no one at the specific historical moment when it still mattered made that same decision for them. This is the part that genuinely unsettles me every time I go back through the scholarly literature on this question, because the standard intellectual history of the Western tradition tends to frame the loss of ancient knowledge as tragic but ultimately manageable. The Renaissance recovered what was recoverable. The scientific revolution rebuilt what needed rebuilding. We got where we needed to go. And there's a version of that story that is accurate as far as it goes. But it papers over something that becomes visible when you actually trace specific intellectual traditions through the gap. Historian of mathematics Reveal Netz has written about what the loss of Archimedes' full mathematical corpus, much of which was destroyed at Alexandria or in the broader collapse of ancient manuscript culture, meant for the development of calculus. Newton and Leibniz independently developed calculus in the late 17th century CE. Archimedes, working in the 3rd century BCE, was using methods of exhaustion and infinitesimal reasoning, that sit conceptually very close to integral calculus. He was not there yet, but he was closer than Newton would have needed to start from. Had Archimedes' complete works and the mathematical tradition they belonged to been available to every generation of mathematician between Alexandria and Cambridge? The calculus that enabled Newtonian mechanics, that enabled the Industrial Revolution, that enabled the entire mathematical apparatus of modern physics, it might have existed by the 2nd century CE. Not definitely, not certainly, but plausibly, given the trajectory the ancient mathematical tradition was actually on before the institutional infrastructure that supported it was dismantled. And that's where the civilizational timeline question becomes genuinely vertiginous. Because the Industrial Revolution is not just a technical event, it is a threshold, a transformation of the human relationship with energy and production that triggered everything that followed. Modern medicine, modern agriculture, modern communication. Everything that defines the material conditions of contemporary life has the Industrial Revolution somewhere in its genealogy. If the mathematical tradition that enabled Newtonian mechanics arrives 5 centuries earlier because the Alexandrian intellectual community remained intact and the knowledge accumulated rather than being reconstructed, then the question is not just whether we understand physics faster. The question is whether the Industrial Revolution happens in the 7th century CE rather than the 18th. Whether the entire chain of material progress that produced the world we live in runs 1,000 years ahead of schedule, which somehow makes every subsequent implication even larger, not smaller. I want to be honest about what the scholarly record can and cannot support here, because this is where historians genuinely disagree, and I think the disagreement is itself instructive. Some historians, and this is a real intellectual position, not a fringe one, argue that the library's destruction did not significantly delay scientific progress because the knowledge it housed was not, in fact, the bottleneck. That ancient science was limited not by access to accumulated texts, but by the absence of experimental method, by the philosophical frameworks that treated empirical observation as inferior to pure reasoning, by economic and social structures that directed intellectual talent away from applied investigation. Classicist Peter Green has made versions of this argument, that the Alexandrian tradition, for all its genuine brilliance, was still largely a tradition of synthesis and commentary rather than the kind of paradigm-shattering empirical inquiry that eventually produced the scientific revolution. And there's something to that. The ancient world produced extraordinary thinkers. It did not produce a culture of systematic experimental falsification in the modern sense. But here's what the historical record actually shows when you take that argument seriously and follow it to its conclusion. The experimental method did not appear from nowhere in 17th century Europe. It was constructed painstakingly by thinkers who were themselves working at the edge of what ancient mathematics, ancient natural philosophy, and ancient astronomical observation had bequeathed them. Galileo was working with Archimedean mathematics and Ptolemaic astronomical data. Newton was, famously, standing on the shoulders of giants. The question is not whether the library's survival would have changed human intellectual nature. It is whether a continuous, unbroken transmission of the most advanced ancient technical knowledge would have moved the point at which European thinkers were ready to take the next conceptual step forward in time, because they would have been starting from a higher baseline. The answer to that question, genuinely, honestly, is that we don't know. But the evidence that the starting point matters, that the accumulation of prior knowledge accelerates subsequent discovery, is not controversial. That is essentially what the history of science shows us, taken as a whole. Which brings us, finally, to what I think is the most quietly devastating implication of this entire alternate history. The one that took me the longest to sit with after I first worked through the timeline carefully. We talk about the Library of Alexandria as a loss to scholarship, as a tragedy for historians and classicists. And it is that, but it is also potentially something considerably larger and more personal than that. The diseases that killed people in the medieval world were, in many cases, diseases that Alexandrian medicine was on a trajectory to understand. The navigational disasters, the engineering failures, the agricultural collapses that shaped the contours of medieval and early modern poverty were the products, in part, of a civilizational knowledge base that had been truncated at a critical moment and had to reconstruct itself from first principles over many centuries. Every person who died of a disease that a more advanced medicine could have treated, every child who starved because agricultural knowledge was not where it could have been, they are not the victims of a building burning in Egypt. They are the downstream consequences of a slow, incremental institutional failure that no one stopped because no one understood, at the time, what stopping it would have been worth. And here is the thing that makes this not just history, but something urgently present. We are not immune to the same failure mode. The Library of Alexandria did not die because ancient people were careless or stupid. It died because the institutions that housed it lost political support, because the scholars who staffed it dispersed toward better-funded alternatives, because the long-term value of preserved accumulated knowledge was systematically underweighted relative to immediate political and religious priorities. That failure mode is not ancient. It is as current as every underfunded archive, every digitization project that runs out of money, every scientific data set that exists only on aging servers that no one has been specifically tasked with maintaining. The specific story is ancient. The underlying vulnerability is not. The world we live in, with its modern medicine and its astronomical precision and its mathematical tools, is not the product of inevitable human progress marching toward a predetermined destination. It is the product of the specific knowledge that survived, the specific institutions that held, the specific moments when someone decided that what had been accumulated was worth protecting. The timeline we inhabit is the timeline we got because of what was lost in Alexandria and what wasn't. The timeline we could have had was closer than most people want to believe. And the timeline we keep is entirely up to whether we make different choices than the people who let the library die. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about how fragile human knowledge actually is.